sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They had said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, the great Pittsburgh theologian, and I just use air quotes, great Pittsburgh theologian by the name of Mike Lang, coined a phrase a long time ago that went something like this. And he said, and you'd have to be here to believe it. Where I love hearing that line because it means something awesome just happened that I wanted to have happen. Many of you probably know that Mike Lang is not a theologian. He's a sportscaster for the Pittsburgh Penguins, who has a wide range of very flamboyant sayings that capture the moment of a hockey game. They reflect both his exuberance and the genuine excitement that you experience when the team you're rooting for does something good to win the game. There's almost nothing more exciting when the team you're rooting for does something exciting to win the game, especially at the end. It's just exciting. And the thing, though, with this expression, and you'd have to be here to believe it, is that on one hand, it technically isn't true, is it? Now, I've watched many hockey games on TV and listened to many more on the radio, and I was not physically present at the arena. Yet when I saw it on TV or heard it on the radio, I believed it, right? Even though I wasn't there. But on the other hand, I have been to several Penguin games in person, as well as other events in other places, and when something awesome happens at the game and you are there to see it, there's something about that expression that rings amazingly true. You do have to be there to believe it, don't you? Something, because there's a certain atmosphere that exists at any event, be it a sporting event, a concert, or whatever, that makes being there way, way better and way, way different than watching it on TV or hearing about it later. That's why I stayed to the bitter end, because I don't want to miss the greatest comeback, because I left early thinking the game was over. That happens before, you know. It's happened. It's not going to happen to me. I stayed to the end. We could be down 15 runs, 2 outs in the ninth inning, and guess where I'm still sitting? Right there, because you don't want to miss, because you have to be there to believe it. Most of us watched on TV, both stunned and horrified, on September 11th, 2001, as the World Trade Center was destroyed by terrorists and it fell down. We saw it. We even heard it. And we felt it. But the people who were in Lower Manhattan on that morning experienced it significantly different than we did, because to get the full extent, you would have to be here to believe it. Atmosphere is real. It's tangible. You can't see it. It doesn't always come through the TV, and you can't recreate it later when you're telling the story. Yes, indeed, you'd have to be here to believe it. And on that first Sunday morning, after Jesus' resurrection, when Mark tells us that the Sabbath was over, 3 women, one called Mary Magdalene, one called Mary, the mother of James, and one called Salome, brought spices so they could anoint Jesus' body. And I've said this many times, but it bears repeating. These women weren't going to the tomb to see if Jesus was there. They weren't going to check and see if his resurrection prediction was accurate. They fully expected him to be in the tomb. I mean, the chief concern, as it is expressed in verse 3, when they ask each other, who's going to roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? That is, after all, a pretty big deal. You know, did you ever go somewhere wondering how you're going to get in? It's a big deal. They were going there to anoint his body. And if they can't get the stone rolled away, and no one is there to roll the stone away, then they got up early and made that trip for nothing. You know, one may wonder why they didn't bring some people with them to help roll the stone. Right? They could have called a couple of us, and we'd have gone out and rolled stone for them, right? You know, he'd call some strapping young men to go over and roll the stone for them. But they wondered. And in any event, all they were trying to do that morning is anoint his body with spices. Basically, the Jewish version of putting flowers on the grave of a loved one. Kind of harmless. They just had their stuff. They're going to go to the grave. They want to do their thing. Now, it isn't clear from Mark how far it was from where they were, from where they lived, to the garden where the tomb was. We get the impression it wasn't that far, Luke tells us that when Peter heard about it, he got up and he ran to the tomb. So it's at least within a reasonable running distance. And the other disciple, I guess, was faster than Peter. Remember, he got there first. And so it doesn't, you get the impression it's not that far. But you don't really know how far it was. And verse 4 tells us, when they looked up, the women looked up, they saw the stone had already been rolled away. Oh, maybe somebody got there before they did. And there's already flowers on the grave. You got to figure out how to put yours in there. They got to anoint the body to do what they do. But Mark also tells us it was a very large stone. I mean, it was big. One thing we know about stones is they get very heavy very quickly. A simple rock the size of a shoebox can be pretty heavy. A rock big enough to block an entryway to a tomb must have been several hundred, if not 1,000 pounds. It was huge. It was going to be hard to move. And even having seen that stone rolled away, the women still aren't thinking resurrection. They're thinking, all right, we can get in to anoint the body the way we want to. But verse 5 tells us that as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. I mean, who is this guy? Is it even a guy? Is it an angel? Who in the world is this young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side? Somebody ought to try to figure that out. But even more than that, what's he doing here? And where's Jesus? Or is this Jesus? And they didn't recognize it. Some good questions. But we see that they're alarmed. They're alarmed. They aren't jumping for joy because they just figured out Jesus is alive. They're alarmed. They're bothered. They came to execute their custom. And now they seemingly can't do it. The young man notices this, and in verse 6 he says, don't be alarmed. You're looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, right? The one who was crucified. And while we still don't know who this guy is, we do know that he knows who they were looking for. He knows they're looking for Jesus. And not just any Jesus, the Nazarene Jesus. The one who was crucified. You're looking for the dead guy, right? You're looking for that dead Nazarene carpenter fellow. Well, guess what? And this is my favorite part. This guy says, he has risen. He's not here. And if Mike Lang were giving the play-by-play, it's at this point where he'd say, and you'd have to be here to believe it. So these three women were there that day. And I'm not sure what's going through their heads at this point. But the young man continues, see the place where they laid him. There's the evidence. He's not here. They laid him right here, and he most definitely was dead. And now he's most definitely not there, but there's more. Go tell his disciples and Peter something. Ever wonder why Peter got singled out here? Peter often shot his mouth off. He was often seen to be the lead spokesperson of the group. But there's a lot of speculation over the years as to why Jesus says, tell my disciples and Peter. Leads you to believe that maybe somehow Peter's on the hook somehow. You remember it wasn't long ago, just a few days earlier, Peter denied knowing Jesus, and he did it 3 times. And at the end of that, when he went off and he wept bitterly, Peter's probably feeling about as low as you can feel at this point. You ever feel like weeping bitterly? Maybe not quite the extent that Peter did, but Peter's low. He probably feels a little bit guilty of it should have been him on the cross instead of Jesus. Or if he'd have spoken up, maybe he could have done something about it. But Peter, for as gutsy as Peter seemed to be, chickened out at a crucial moment. And he's feeling low. So Jesus, as he so often does, wants Peter to know that he still loves him and counts him as one of his own. Peter disowned Jesus. We see Jesus doesn't disown Peter. Even when we've disowned Jesus, Jesus will never disown us. Jesus has big plans. So he tells the disciples and Peter. Jesus wants Peter there too, because these plans include him. And you can read about Peter. Peter went on to do amazing things for the Lord. But tell them that he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Now back in Mark 14, rewind a tad in Mark 14, as Jesus is predicting Peter's denial, he says in verse 28 of Mark 14, but after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. He told him that just a couple days ago. Guys, I'm going to die. But relax. In a couple days, I'll be alive again. I'll see you in Galilee. Now, you would have thought, based on that the guys would have been like, okay, guys, As soon as we find out the tomb's empty, we're going to Galilee to see Jesus. But they don't. They're not there. They're somewhere else in the mental process. He already told them what would happen. But notice it isn't the disciples who go to the tomb in the morning. It's these three women who are given this message to give to the disciples. Jesus is going to show himself to them. And he wants them to be there. Because you know what? You'd have to be here to believe it, wouldn't you? Meanwhile, Mark tells us in verse 8, trembling and bewildered. I don't like being trembling and bewildered. You like trembling and bewildered? I've been there, but it's not the funnest place to be. But trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Something awesome happened that morning, and these three women were the first to witness it. And before we get on their cases for trembling and being bewildered, let's ask ourselves what we would have done if that would have been us. And it probably wouldn't have been me, because if you're going to wake up early in the morning to go do something, I'm generally not part of that crowd. And so I'll come along later after you've caused some trouble. But it was early in the morning. And under certain circumstances, there are some things you do have to be there to believe it. But in this case, I think they were so awestruck that they didn't believe it because I don't think they understood. There's some things that sometimes it's like you have to figure out later. And you catch up to it on the way home because it went right past you. It happens sometimes. I mean, eventually it became clear. It didn't take long, though, for everything to become crystal clear to everyone, the women, the disciples, and a whole bunch of other people, that Jesus had indeed been risen from the grave. And the tomb is empty. And you know what? You don't have to be there to believe it. The biggest concern the women had that morning was moving a stone. Right? Stone was nothing for God. What's your biggest concern this morning? What's the big stone you need to have moved? We all know what the big stone is we want moved. It's nothing for God. Nothing for God. But know this. The angels didn't roll the stone away so Jesus could get out. They rolled it away so others could see that he had indeed risen from the dead. And you'd have to be here to believe it. Do you believe that this morning? Do you believe? What do you see? What do you see when you look at the tomb? Do you see a giant stone or do you see an empty grave? Hopefully you see the empty grave. That stone's probably still there. Because who would want to move it now? Doesn't need to move now. It's out of the way. But the fellow who wrote the great hymn we're going to sing, He Lives, was asked one time how he knew that Jesus was alive. And it took quite a while for him to respond. He didn't respond right away. It's one of those questions that you ponder for a while. And when he finally did respond, he responded with the song. You ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart. We're going to sing it this morning. But do you mean it? Could you sing it in person? If a person asked you that question, so he said, how do you know that Jesus is alive? Are you ready to burst into song and say, you ask me how I know he lives? He lives within my heart. When you ask Jesus into your heart to be your Savior and Lord, he comes in and he redeems you and he's preparing a place for you in glory. Now you know what? You don't have to be here to believe it, but you do have to believe it to be there, don't you? Let's pray. Father God, we thank you, Lord, for resurrection. Lord, that the tomb is empty. Because the tomb is empty, Lord, you've made a way for us to be with you. Fill us with your Spirit, Lord, and Lord, renew us, refresh us, restore us. Lord, bring healing. Move the stone. Move the stone so we can see. Lord, and as we sing triumphantly, Lord, he lives. Let it be true in our hearts this morning. In your name, amen.